Hi, fourth grade. I'm Mrs. Kite, and I am super excited to be here with you today. Today, we're going to go through the reading for day 3 of Packet 4. That was set for April 27th. And I'm going to first read the passage. I'm going to pull it up here on my screen. Then I'm going to go back through and I'm going to highlight some important parts of the passage. And then I'm going to get started on my Foursquare. So I hope you will join me. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you real quick. And what we're reading today is chapter 2 of I Survived Gettysburg. We read chapter 1 on Monday and Tuesday. So this is a continuation of the story. What's important is that when we are reading, we fill out the Foursquare for each chapter of a story when we read a chapter book, because things do change chapter to chapter, including setting, the characters who are talking, the events. All this is important, and if we're going to answer our questions, if we're going to do our work, that Foursquare and those notes really help us out a lot. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull up this in full screen, and I'm just going to go through and I'm going to read it through all the way. I want you to follow along with me. I'm not going to stop or pause because this is what we're going to call our movie theater read, and we're just going to listen. So this was 3 weeks earlier, late afternoon, Knox's farm, Oak Ridge, Virginia. Thomas crept slowly toward the squirrel. It was fat and would make a fine supper. Just thinking about it made his stomach rumble. Times were tough on the farm. His owner, Mr. Knox, could barely feed his horses or his slaves. Thomas was just about to snare the squirrel when his little sister's voice sang out, "Thomas!" The squirrel darted away. Thomas turned toward Bertie, fuming. She was only 5 years old, but she knew better than to yell when he was trying to hunt. But then there she was, with her crooked grin and twiggy legs rushing toward him. His heart turned to mush. "Look what I caught," she said proudly, holding out her cupped hands. Inside was a little green snake covered with mud. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said. Thomas had a smile. That was Bertie. Give her a grimy little snake and she'd see a beautiful butterfly. Bertie held up her hands and looked at the baby snake, putting her face so close Thomas thought she might kiss it. "All right," she said to the snake. "I'm going to let you go now." She crouched down and released it into the dirt. They watched as the creature streaked away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Thomas wondered, would he and Bertie ever be as free as that snake? They'd been born as slaves on this farm. Their mama had died here when Bertie was a baby, and 2 summers ago their cousin Clem had been sold away to a plantation down in Mississippi where slaves were worked half to death. Clem was only 17 at the time, but he'd been almost like a father to them after Mama died. He'd watched over them, cared for them, protected them, and he taught Thomas about freedom. He said that not far from here, in the states up north, slavery was illegal. People there believed it was evil. Clem told stories about slaves who'd run away from their owners. They'd followed the North Star, the brightest star in the sky. They traveled for days and days to make it to freedom. They were brave enough to run through dark forests and snake-filled swamps. They were clever enough to outsmart the slave catchers who tracked them with ferocious dogs that could smell them from miles away. But then they make it to freedom, most like we will one day, Clem would say, his eyes flashing like tiny torches. "One day we will run." He'd close his eyes. "Picture it, Thomas," he'd say. "Picture it in your mind. Can't you see us? Can't you see us all together?" And Thomas could see it. Bright pictures that filled his mind and gave him a flickering feeling of hope in his heart. But then Clem was taken, and those pictures went dark. Just thinking about Clem gave Thomas a searing pain, even worse than the lash of Mr. Knox's whip. Now the only picture in his mind was one of Clem being dragged away in chains. "Are you sad, Thomas?" Bertie asked, looking up at him. He put his hand on her head. "How can I be sad with you here with me?" he said. With Clem gone, it was up to Thomas to make Bertie feel safe. "I'm just thinking about how to catch us a nice supper," he said. He sent Bertie back to their shack to weed their garden. But just a few minutes later, she was back. She was breathing hard, her eyes wide and scared. Was she hurt? "Those men are here," she whispered, grabbing Thomas's hand. Hardly anyone came to the farm anymore. Mrs. Knox was dead. Mr. Knox's 2 sons were gone, fighting in the war. Those bad men, Bertie said, the ones who took Clem. Thomas's heart cracked open. I heard them talking, Bertie said, her words choked by tears. They've come for you. Thomas heard voices from across the field. Mr. Knox was calling for him. Boy, Mr. Knox was yelling, I need you now. Thomas stood there, frozen. He heard Clem's voice in his mind. Run! Thomas grabbed Bertie, and like that little snake, Thomas and Bertie disappeared into the shadowy forest. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go back and we're going to do a reread. We're going to do that reread, and as we reread, that's going to help us fill out our Foursquare. So before I fill out my Foursquare, I'm going to go back, reread, and I'm going to underline or highlight the important parts of the story. So that's what we're focusing on today, is we're going to highlight the important parts of the story that are going to help us fill out our Foursquares on our own. All right, so we start with chapter 2, 3 weeks earlier, late afternoon, Knox's farm, Oak Ridge, Virginia. That gives us a lot of information just right here in this area that's colored. Now, our Foursquares all include characters and setting, and conflict and resolution. These are very important parts of the story. My class, you will also have beginning, middle, end. You're going to have your events. You'll also have your theme. So we're going to be looking right now today is the important parts is we're going to look for setting, and we're going to look for characters, and we're also going to look for any important events that can help us figure out the rest of our Foursquare. So 3 weeks earlier, late afternoon, Knox's farm, Oak Ridge, Virginia. This gives me a time. The time here is late afternoon. So I'm going to highlight that because our when is a W word that's really important for setting. So that helps me find when. It also gives me a date, 3 weeks earlier. And by 3 weeks earlier, they're referring back to chapter 1. And a date is also an important part of that W, that when for our setting. Knox's farm, Oak Ridge, Virginia is a place. And our other W for setting is where. So where, Knox's farm, Oak Ridge, Virginia helps give us a where. We have already got everything we need to fill out the setting part of our Foursquare just by going back through and rereading. Now we're going to read the first paragraph and we're going to see if we can find anything else important that's going to help us out with our Foursquare. Thomas crept slowly toward the squirrel. It was fat and would make a fine supper. Just thinking about it made his stomach rumble. Times were tough on the farm. Oh, see, Mrs. Kite, she makes some typos sometimes. His owner, Mr. Knox, could barely feed his horses. There's another one, or his slaves. All right, so there's some important parts here that introduce us a little bit to the characters. So the two characters I see here is I see two names. I see Thomas. So I'm going to highlight that with my highlighting tool up here. And I see Mr. Knox. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to highlight with my highlight tool here. All right. Another important part about that is times were tough on the farm. This tells us a lot about what things were like on the farm. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just put that times were tough. I'm going to highlight that. You don't want to highlight too much, but you want to highlight just enough that's going to help you with your Foursquare. And I think this part is really important here. His owner, what does it mean that Thomas has an owner? I want you to think about that. We talked a lot when we talked about Jamestown. 1619 with the arrival of Africans. When Africans arrived, they were what? Okay. Now, if you said slaves, you were right. So if Thomas has an owner, then Thomas is we can infer, and infer means, that's a fancy word for, it's a fancy word for guess. So we can infer that Thomas is a slave if Mr. Knox is his owner. All right, so now we're going to read the next 3 sentences and we're going to see if there's anything super important there. Thomas was just about to snare the squirrel when his little sister's voice sang out, "Thomas!" The squirrel darted away. So there is one important part here that refers to another character. So when we go back through those 3 sentences, we see that Thomas, the person who is shouting his name, is Thomas's little sister. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that because we know that his little sister is going to be an important part of the story. Thomas turned toward Bertie fuming. She was only 5 years old, but she knew better than to yell when he was trying to hunt. But then there she was with her crooked grin and twiggy legs rushing toward him. His heart turned to mush. All right, so in these 4 sentences, we've got a little bit more information. We have his little sister's name, and so I'm going to give you a minute. What is his little sister's name? Want you to highlight it before I do. All right, I'm going to go ahead and highlight it here. It's Bertie. We have this interesting word here, fuming, and we'll have to use our context clues for that. So Thomas turned toward Bertie fuming. She was only 5 years old, but she knew better than to yell when he was trying to hunt. So when he lost the squirrel, do you think he was happy with Bertie? Do you think he was angry with Bertie? That's right. So he's probably very angry with Bertie. So we can infer that fuming probably means that he's angry. Over here, but then there she was with a crooked grin and twiggy legs rushing toward him. His heart turned to mush. I'm going to highlight that because I think that's important. I think that that tells us a little bit about how he feels about his little sister. "Look what I caught," she said proudly, holding out her cupped hands. Inside was a little green snake covered with mud. "Isn't it beautiful?" she said. Thomas had a smile. That was Bertie. Give her a grimy little snake and she'd see a beautiful butterfly. This last sentence here, I think, really helps summarize the sentences that came before. And I want you to think about what this means. That was Bertie. Give her a grimy little snake and she'd see a beautiful butterfly. What do you think it means that she sees something that other people are scared of or think are ugly and she thinks it's pretty and she thinks it's beautiful? So I want you to think about Bertie's character traits there. What kind of person do you think Bertie is? So Bertie held up her hands and looked at the baby snake, putting her face so close Thomas thought she might kiss it. "All right," she said to the snake, "I'm going to let you go now." She crouched down and released it into the dirt. Now, I'm not going to highlight anything for these 3 sentences because even though they're an important part of the story, I feel like we've already highlighted that one sentence about Bertie, that giving her a grimy little snake and she'd see a beautiful butterfly. These 3 sentences are just giving us more information that connects to this. They're just giving us more detail about Bertie as a person. So we don't need to highlight that for our 4 square right now. They watched as the creature streaked away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest. Thomas wondered, would he and Bertie ever be as free as that snake? So there is something I'm going to highlight here. I'm going to highlight, would he and Bertie ever be as free as that snake? I'm highlighting that because Thomas is asking himself a question. Why do you think Thomas is wondering if him and Bertie will ever be free? We've already talked about that we can infer that Thomas is a slave. And if Bertie is his little sister, can we also infer that she's a slave? Right? And it seems that Thomas is dreaming of freedom. So we're going to go ahead and continue reading, and we're going to see if we can prove that inference with information from the text. They'd been born as slaves on this farm. Their mama had died here when Bertie was a baby, and 2 summers ago their cousin Clem had been sold away to a plantation down in Mississippi, where slaves were worked half to death. All right, so right here, I think this is all pretty important. They've been born as slaves on this farm. All right, so that proves our inference we were talking about earlier, that they were slaves. And then over here, even their cousin was a slave. And this is important, I think, that Clem had been sold away to a plantation in Mississippi where slaves were worked half to death. So we talked about it often in Virginia studies. Were slaves always treated well? Were they always treated kindly? I want you to think about that when we're talking about where Clem was sold away to. Was that a good place for Clem to be? Clem was only 17 at the time, but he'd been almost like a father to them after Mama died. He'd watched over them, cared for them, protected them, and he taught Thomas about freedom. So here, I think the important parts here are that he'd been almost like a father to them. That tells us a lot about Clem as a character. So I'm going to go ahead and highlight that. I want to make sure I have Clem's name there because I want to make sure that I include him in my characters list. He taught Thomas about freedom, I think is incredibly important, especially if we consider what happened in chapter 1. He said that not far from here in the states up north, slavery was illegal. And I'm going to highlight that because we know that this story is I Survived the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg did not take place in Virginia, it took place in Pennsylvania, but it was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, which we're learning about in Virginia Studies. People there believed it was evil. Clem told stories about slaves who'd run away from their owners. They'd followed the North Star, the brightest star in the sky. They traveled for days and days to make its freedom. They were brave enough to run through dark forests and snake-filled swamps. They were clever enough to outsmart the slave catchers who tracked them with ferocious dogs that could smell them from miles away. So I think an important thing to remember here is that Clem is talking about slaves who'd run away from their owners. And that's important because we heard Thomas earlier talking about wondering if him and Birdie would be free. But did they make it to freedom? Most like we will one day. Clem would say, his eyes flashing like tiny torches. One day we will run. And I think that this is important here, is that Clem really believed that they would one day run away. And we're going to go ahead and highlight one day we will run. He'd close his eyes. Picture it, Thomas, he'd say. Picture it in your mind. Can't you see us? Can't you see us all together? Right, we've got a few more sentences there, and I'm not going to highlight any of this because I think that is connecting back to that one day we will run. We have that highlighted already, and we want to only highlight the important parts so we're not overwhelmed when we go to do our Foursquare. And Thomas could see it, bright pictures that filled his mind. It gave him a flickering feeling of hope in his chest. But then Clem was taken and those pictures went dark. So this is important here, the fact that Clem was taken. We hit on that earlier. So does anybody remember where Clem went? If we go back a few slides, we can see that Clem their cousin Clem had been sold away to a plantation down in Mississippi. So make sure that we're connecting those ideas that happened earlier. Just thinking about Clem gave Thomas a searing pain, even worse than the lash of Mr. Knox's whip. Now the only picture in his mind was one of Clem being dragged away in chains. So I think this is really, really important, the fact that he's hurting worse than a whip, and that lash of Mr. Knox's whip, Clem being dragged away in chains, that tells us more about how they were treated. And slaves weren't necessarily treated very nicely. They were treated as property. And people like Mr. Knox were talking about the lash of Mr. Knox's whip. So that means he was whipping Thomas. Are you sad, Thomas? Birdie asked, looking up at him. He put his hand on her head. How can I be sad with you here with me? He said. With Clem gone, it was up to Thomas to make Birdie feel safe. All right, so I think one of the most important things there is that it was up to Thomas to make Birdie feel safe with Clem gone. So that tells us that Thomas feels responsible for his little sister. He sent Birdie back to their shack to weed their garden, but just a few minutes later she was back. She was breathing hard, her eyes wide and scared. So now I have to consider what's important in this paragraph. When I go back, she came back really quickly after Thomas sent her away. And I think it's important how she came back, what she was doing. It says here, she was breathing hard, her eyes wide, and scared. So if her eyes are wide and scared, that tells us that Birdie saw something bad. She's scared for some reason, and we're going to find out why. Was she hurt? Those men are here, she whispered, grabbing Thomas's hand. Hardly anyone came to the farm anymore. Mrs. Knox was dead. Mr. Knox's 2 sons were gone, fighting in the war. Those bad men, Birdie said, the ones who took Clem. Thomas's heart cracked open. I heard them talking, Birdie said, her words choked by tears. They've come for you. Thomas heard voices from across the field. Mr. Knox was calling for him. Boy, Mr. Knox was yelling, I need you now. Thomas stood there, frozen. He heard Clem's voice in his mind. Run! Thomas grabbed Birdie. And like that little snake, Thomas and Birdie disappeared into the shadowy forest. Oh, man, I read too much. Sometimes the story just carries you away. So we're going to go back bit by bit. All right, so we know that hardly anyone came to the farm anymore. So it tells us a little bit about why, but I think the important part is that hardly anyone ever comes. And then Birdie tells us who exactly came. Those bad men, Birdie said, the ones who took Clem. Then we talked earlier about the fact that Clem was taken away because he'd been sold to a plantation in Mississippi, a scary place where they worked their slaves half to death. So they're treated even worse than Mr. Knox is treating them. Thomas's heart cracked open. I heard them talking, Birdie said, her words choked by tears. They've come for you. Of course, this is a very important turning point in our chapter. It is because now the men have come to buy Thomas. Thomas heard voices from across the field. Mr. Knox was calling for him. Boy, Mr. Knox was yelling, I need you now. Thomas stood there, frozen. He heard Clem's voice in his mind. Run. And I think this is what's important here is that he is, is that he's hearing Clem's voice in his mind and he's hearing it to run. Thomas grabbed Birdie, and like that little snake, Thomas and Birdie disappeared into the shadowy forest. So here, I'm going to go ahead and highlight that Thomas grabbed Birdie, because that means he's taking Birdie with him, and that Thomas and Birdie are disappearing into the forest. All right, and now that I've highlighted and I've gone back, this is going to make it a little bit easier for me to come out here and then fill in my foursquare. And we should fill in a foursquare every time we read. My foursquare looks like this. We have characters and setting, beginning, middle, end, conflict and resolution, and theme. And each chapter will have something in there that will help you with that. If your foursquare looks a little different for your teacher, that's okay. Everything we've highlighted is going to help you out if you were highlighting your story with me. So I'm really glad that you guys joined me today for this. I'm so excited to get to work with you guys. Make sure you're paying attention to our channel as fourth grade teachers keep uploading. All of us will try to help you with different things. Fourth grade is better together. I can't wait to talk to you later. See you soon. Bye, guys.